In the early years of World War II, long before the thunder of Allied tanks rolled through France or the Red Ball Express roared across Europe, there was one mechanic with a dream that no one took seriously. He wasn't a general, he wasn't a weapons designer, and he didn't have a fancy title. He was a simple man who believed that victory didn't just come from the front lines, it came from the ability to move, supply, and sustain those who fought there. His creation wasn't glamorous. It didn't have armor or guns. It was a truck, plain, boxy, and built for one purpose, to haul supplies through hell. But to the military bureaucrats of the time, it was little more than a worthless design. In the late 1930s, the U.S. Army was still recovering from decades of underfunding and outdated thinking. The lessons of World War I had taught them little about modern warfare's need for speed and flexibility. Mechanization was still new. Trucks, jeeps, and transport vehicles were seen as secondary to the tanks and artillery pieces that generals loved to parade. So when a young Army mechanic proposed a new kind of military transport truck, something durable, simple, and easy to repair in the field, the idea barely made it past the first desk. The truck in question was a revolutionary concept for its time. Unlike the heavy, fuel-hungry transporters the Army had relied on, this design emphasized standardization. Every bolt, every part, every axle was made to be interchangeable. A mechanic's dream in the chaos of war. The goal was simple: create a vehicle that could be mass-produced quickly, repaired anywhere, and driven by almost anyone. But that simplicity was exactly what made the higher-ups scoff. In their eyes, a war machine needed to look powerful, not practical. The mechanic, whose name would later be lost to history but whose design would fuel one of the greatest logistical operations ever attempted, refused to give up. He argued that war would not be won only by the fastest tanks or the strongest artillery, but by the steady movement of fuel, food, ammunition, and spare parts. He spoke about the lifeline of war, the invisible arteries that kept entire armies alive. But in the era before Pearl Harbor, few were willing to listen. When war finally broke out for America in 1941, the U.S. Army suddenly realized how unprepared it truly was. The Great Mobilization required more than soldiers. It required transport, organization, and efficiency on a scale never seen before. The Army Quartermaster Corps scrambled to find vehicles that could survive rugged terrain, carry heavy loads, and keep up with the advancing front lines. And that's when someone remembered the worthless truck design sitting in a file drawer, collecting dust. The design was revisited, refined, and finally put into production. The result was a rugged, no-nonsense vehicle. Not beautiful, not fast, but reliable. It could carry fuel drums, ammunition crates, rations, or spare tank parts. It could traverse muddy roads, climb rough hills, and keep running even when damaged. It was the truck that could go where others couldn't. Its strength lay not in power, but in endurance. The ability to keep moving no matter what. As the war intensified, the Allied invasion of Europe in 1944 would test every logistical system to the breaking point. When the beaches of Normandy were secured, the real challenge began. Supplying the rapidly advancing troops pushing inland. France's railroads were destroyed, bridges were shattered, and German resistance made every mile dangerous. The Allied armies were moving faster than anyone expected, and their supply lines were stretched thin. Every tank needed fuel, every soldier needed food, and every gun needed ammunition. And now that worthless truck became the only thing standing between momentum and disaster. The idea that had once been dismissed as too simple became the foundation for one of the most daring supply operations in history. Convoys of these trucks, tens of thousands of them, would soon thunder across France in endless columns. They would carry everything the front line needed, often under fire, often at night, often without rest. These convoys would come to be known as the Red Ball Express, a name that would echo through history as a symbol of determination, innovation, and sheer grit. It's poetic in a way. The very design that the Army once called worthless turned out to be priceless. It wasn't about glamour or power. It was about function, about reliability under pressure. Those trucks, born from the mind of a mechanic who simply understood that victory runs on wheels and fuel, would become the unsung heroes of the Allied push into Nazi territory. Before the Red Ball Express roared to life, these trucks were just another piece of machinery, but the soldiers who drove them would soon learn that they were more than vehicles. They were lifelines. They carried not just supplies, but hope. When ammunition ran low or food failed to reach the front, these trucks delivered survival itself. Every gallon of fuel, every crate of shells, every sack of flour represented the difference between victory and retreat. That first mechanic could never have imagined how his design would one day keep entire armies moving across Europe. But his belief that the simplest ideas often hold the greatest power would soon be proven right on the dusty, dangerous roads of France. The worthless truck would go on to define an era of logistics unlike anything the world had ever seen. The war was changing, and so was the way it was fought. In the chaos of global conflict, the humble truck, once laughed at by generals and ignored by bureaucrats, would become a weapon of endurance, a symbol that sometimes it's not the biggest gun that wins the war, but the vehicle that carries the bullets. When the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy in June 1944, the world witnessed one of the most ambitious invasions in military history. Thousands of ships, aircraft, tanks, and troops poured into northern France in a single thunderous surge. But after the beaches were taken, a new kind of battle began. One fought not with bullets, but with fuel, rations, and tires grinding down dusty roads. The front lines were moving faster than anyone had planned, and the Allied supply system was breaking under its own success. Victory was within reach, but only if someone could keep the armies fed, fueled, and fighting. It was in this moment of chaos that the worthless truck design proved its worth. As the Allies pushed deeper into France, their tanks devoured fuel faster than it could be delivered. Every Sherman tank burned through nearly 800 liters of gasoline a day. Aircraft needed endless drums of aviation fuel, artillery required mountains of shells, and soldiers needed constant food and ammunition. The railways across northern France, once the backbone of transportation, lay in ruins thanks to Allied bombers. The solution? The roads. But those roads were narrow, cratered, and jammed with vehicles. Supplies began to pile up on the Normandy beaches, forming what soldiers bitterly called the Great Backlog. Food rotted, fuel sat idle, and ammunition was stranded far from the front. The generals were desperate. Patton's Third Army was advancing at lightning speed, but soon his tanks would stop. Not because of the enemy, but because they'd run out of gas. That's when the call went out for an impossible task. Move everything. Hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies, across hundreds of miles every single day. And the only thing capable of doing it was that once dismissed truck. By August 1944, the U.S. Army had put together one of the most ambitious logistics operations in human history. It was named the Red Ball Express, after the railroad term Red Ball, meaning priority cargo that had to move fast, no matter what. The name fit perfectly. The mission was simple on paper, but hellish in execution. Keep a constant stream of trucks moving from the Normandy supply depots to the front lines in northern France, without stopping, without resting 24 hours a day. The system was ingenious. A one-way loop of roads was designated specifically for the express. Trucks would drive fully loaded in one direction, then return empty along another route. Every driver knew the rules. No stopping for anything. If a truck broke down, it was pushed off the road immediately to keep the flow going. Mechanics rode along in some of the convoys, fixing what they could on the move. The speed, coordination, and courage required were incredible. Those worthless trucks became the backbone of the operation. They weren't fast, averaging about 25 miles per hour, but they were unstoppable. They carried fuel drums, ammunition crates, spare tank parts, food and medical supplies. Their engines roared day and night across the French countryside, through bombed-out villages, over rough terrain, and sometimes under the threat of German air attacks. The trucks weren't armored, but the drivers didn't care. They had one mission: keep the front alive. Fuel convoys were especially dangerous. One lucky hit from an enemy fighter could set an entire line of trucks ablaze. Yet the drivers kept going, often with little sleep and no rest. Dust coated their faces, rain soaked their uniforms, and exhaustion became a constant companion. Many were just young men in their 20s, driving through pitch-black nights guided only by dimmed headlights and the sound of engines ahead. The conditions were brutal. The roads were narrow and slippery, and traffic jams could stretch for miles. Bridges were still being rebuilt, and German snipers occasionally took shots at the convoys. But what made the Red Ball Express extraordinary wasn't just the danger, it was the dedication. Every driver knew that if they stopped, an entire army might stop with them. The logistics officers who had once doubted the mechanic's truck design now depended on it completely. They began modifying and upgrading them in the field. Soldiers installed extra fuel tanks, reinforced the suspensions, and even welded armor plates to protect against small arms fire. These trucks became more than vehicles. They became living, roaring proof of what American ingenuity could achieve under pressure. The numbers were staggering. At its peak, the Red Ball Express operated over 6,000 trucks, making more than 900 round trips per day. Between August and November 1944, they delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies. Without that flow of fuel and ammunition, the Allied advance across France would have ground to a halt. Patton himself famously said, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to have gas." The Red Ball Express made sure they did. And as the operation grew, so did the legend of those trucks. Soldiers began painting slogans on their hoods. Things like "Hell on Wheels," "The Big Push," and "No Sleep Till Berlin." They were proud of their machines, even if the world didn't see them as heroes. They knew that without them, the war might have taken a very different turn. But the success came at a cost. Maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep the trucks running. Spare parts were in constant short supply, and many vehicles were held together with whatever could be scavenged. Tires wore out after just a few days on the rough French roads, and engines overheated constantly. Still, the drivers and mechanics found ways to keep them moving. When a truck broke down, its load was quickly transferred to another, and the convoy continued. Stopping wasn't an option. By September 1944, the Red Ball Express had become a symbol of Allied determination. The same generals who had once dismissed the worthless truck now praised it as one of the unsung weapons of victory. Reporters wrote stories about the endless lines of vehicles stretching from Normandy to the front. The roads rumbled day and night, and the glow of headlights in the dark countryside became a familiar sight to soldiers resting in their foxholes. The miracle had happened, not through new weapons or brilliant tactics, but through relentless hard work and a machine built for endurance. The truck that was once a joke had become the lifeline of an entire army. The Red Ball Express was running at full throttle, and the Allies were racing toward victory. But the story wasn't over yet. Behind the roar of the engines were the men who made it all possible. Drivers who risked everything to keep the supplies moving, many of whom had to fight not just the enemy, but the prejudice within their own ranks. When history remembers World War II, it often celebrates the generals, the tank commanders, and the aces of the sky. But behind every victory was a group of men who rarely saw the headlines. The drivers, mechanics, and logisticians who made sure the front lines never went hungry, dry, or unarmed. And nowhere was that truer than in the story of the Red Ball Express. Because behind the roar of those engines and the endless miles of muddy roads were men who fought two wars at once, one against the Axis powers and another against the prejudice that tried to keep them in the shadows. Nearly 75% of the Red Ball Express drivers were African American soldiers. Most of them came from labor or support units, not from combat divisions. At that time, the U.S. military was still segregated. Black soldiers were often assigned to service roles, loading supplies, digging trenches, or driving trucks. But when the Red Ball Express was born, it became clear that these men were the only ones capable of handling the job's intensity. They were disciplined, tireless, and determined to prove that they were just as vital to victory as anyone else. These young men, some barely out of their teens, suddenly found themselves behind the wheel of the Army's most critical lifeline. They drove the rough roads of France day and night, navigating narrow lanes, bomb craters, and bridges that barely stood. Many had never even driven a truck before joining the Army, but the crash training was quick and brutal. Within days, they were put on the road with tons of ammunition, fuel, or rations, and ordered to deliver, no matter what. There was no room for mistakes. The convoys operated under strict rules. Headlights dimmed to avoid enemy aircraft, radio silenced to prevent interception, and no stopping for any reason. If a truck broke down, it was pushed off the road. If it couldn't be repaired fast enough, the cargo was transferred to another vehicle, and the convoy moved on. Time was everything. Every delay meant the front lines risked running out of fuel or ammunition. The drivers slept in their trucks, ate while driving, and often went days without rest. They faced long hours, mechanical breakdowns, and the constant threat of ambush. German planes still patrolled the skies, and the Luftwaffe made several attempts to bomb the convoys. Even nature was an enemy. Rain turned dirt roads into rivers of mud, and dust choked engines during the dry season. Yet somehow the convoys never stopped. Many of these men gave names and personalities to their trucks. Some called them Betsy, Old Reliable, or the Iron Lady. They decorated them with slogans, pin-up art, or good luck charms. The trucks became their homes, their companions, and their pride. They treated them like soldiers treated their rifles, the one thing they could rely on when everything else went wrong. Despite their crucial role, these drivers were not treated as heroes by everyone. Racism was still deeply rooted in the Army. Many white officers doubted that black soldiers could handle such responsibility. But the Red Ball Express shattered that belief. These men proved, mile after mile, that they were not only capable, but exceptional. They delivered under pressure, improvised when things broke down, and kept entire divisions supplied against impossible odds. One driver later recalled, "We didn't have the luxury of fear. If we didn't move, Patton didn't move. And if Patton didn't move, nobody did." That was the reality. Their trucks were the veins pumping life into the Allied advance. Every gallon of gas, every shell, every loaf of bread that reached the front passed through their hands. The camaraderie among the drivers was something special. They formed tight-knit brotherhoods, bonded by exhaustion and danger. When one convoy was hit, others would risk everything to pull their comrades out. Mechanics worked miracles with limited tools, using scrap metal, rope, and even empty fuel cans to patch up damaged vehicles. Many men didn't have proper maps, so they learned to navigate by instinct, following tire tracks, broken signs, or the stars in the night sky. Food was scarce and comfort was a luxury. Soldiers often ate cold rations or whatever they could find along the way. They sang songs to stay awake, joked to keep morale high, and sometimes shared stories of home to forget the chaos around them. The laughter that echoed through the convoys at night wasn't just noise. It was defiance. It was the sound of men refusing to give up. Some of the drivers' courage bordered on legendary. There were stories of trucks driving through enemy fire to deliver ammunition to frontline units. Others braved burning fuel depots or crossed bridges under bombardment just to keep supplies flowing. They knew that failure wasn't an option. If the convoys stopped, the war could stop with them. And while generals planned their strategies on maps, it was these men who turned those plans into reality. They brought the fuel that made the tanks roar, the food that kept soldiers marching, and the bullets that broke the German lines. Every successful offensive, every mile gained, was built on the sweat and endurance of the Red Ball Express drivers. General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself later admitted that the success of the Allied advance depended almost entirely on the Red Ball Express. He called it one of the most outstanding achievements of the war. But behind that praise was a quieter truth, that the men who made it possible often went unrecognized. After the war, many of these drivers returned home to a country that still didn't treat them equally, despite their heroism. Yet their service laid the foundation for change. Their courage, skill, and determination helped pave the way toward the desegregation of the U.S. Army in 1948. In those few months of relentless driving, the Red Ball Express drivers proved something greater than any battlefield victory. They proved the power of unity, resilience, and quiet heroism. They showed that it doesn't take medals or parades to make history. Sometimes it just takes a man behind the wheel of a dusty truck, keeping the engine alive through the night, knowing that thousands are counting on him to deliver. Their story remains one of the most inspiring yet overlooked chapters of World War II, because while the tanks may have taken the glory, it was the trucks and the men who drove them. that truly carried victory forward. By the fall of 1944, the Red Ball Express had become more than a supply route. It was a living, breathing symbol of endurance. For months, the convoys had thundered down the French countryside, turning shattered roads into the arteries of liberation. Those trucks, once mocked as worthless, had carried the lifeblood of an army. But even the strongest engines eventually wear down, and by November, the Red Ball Express began to slow. The German lines were breaking, new ports had opened, and railways were being repaired. Yet even as the convoys faded into history, their legacy had already reshaped the war and the world that would follow. In just 82 days of operation, the Red Ball Express delivered over 400,000 tons of vital supplies to the front. It was a staggering achievement, the kind of logistical miracle that turned the tide of war. Without it, the Allied armies would have stalled in France, giving the Germans time to regroup. Instead, the convoys kept Patton's tanks rolling, Montgomery's troops advancing, and the momentum of liberation alive. The mechanics' worthless truck design had become the backbone of an empire on wheels, a machine of movement that carried victory on its axles. As the convoys wound down, the soldiers who drove them were exhausted but proud. They had faced mud, bullets, exhaustion, and prejudice, and they had won. When the last Red Ball truck rolled into the depots in late November 1944, there was no parade, no medals, no fanfare. The drivers simply turned in their keys, parked their trucks, and went back to other duties. But those who knew logistics, the officers, mechanics, and strategists, understood what had just been accomplished. The Red Ball Express had done the impossible. The Army learned from it too. The lessons of the Red Ball Express changed the very philosophy of modern warfare. For the first time, commanders saw that logistics, not just firepower, determined victory. A tank could be the most powerful weapon in the world, but without fuel, it was just a pile of metal. The Red Ball Express proved that mobility and supply were just as vital as guns and soldiers. It became a blueprint for future military supply systems, influencing everything from the Korean War's MSR routes to the modern convoys used in Iraq and Afghanistan. The trucks themselves, those rugged, simple designs once dismissed by bureaucrats, became legends in their own right. Many were left behind in Europe after the war, used by local farmers or repurposed by rebuilding governments. In some small French towns, those same trucks that once roared with supplies now carried food, lumber, or families trying to rebuild. A few even survive today in museums, their faded olive paint still bearing the insignia of the Red Ball. A red circle on a white background, the mark of America's rolling lifeline. But perhaps the greatest legacy wasn't mechanical. It was human. The Red Ball Express helped change perceptions within the U.S. Army. The bravery and performance of the African-American drivers shattered the racist stereotypes that had kept them confined to menial roles. Their success forced military leaders to acknowledge a truth long ignored, that courage, discipline, and skill have no color. When President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in 1948, officially desegregating the U.S. military, the achievements of the Red Ball Express stood as one of the shining examples of why equality wasn't just right, it was necessary. For the men who had lived it, the memories never faded. Many recalled the endless nights driving under blackout conditions, the smell of fuel in the air, the sound of engines humming like 1,000 beating hearts. They remembered the exhaustion, the laughter, the fear, and the pride of knowing they were doing something that truly mattered. They weren't fighting with rifles or grenades. They were fighting with wheels, determination, and grit. And they won. Even General Eisenhower would later say that without the Red Ball Express, the Allied armies might never have reached Germany before the winter of 1944. That was the truth. The war's greatest victories rested on the backs of those drivers and their so-called worthless trucks. The Battle of the Bulge, the final push across the Rhine, and the collapse of Nazi Germany all relied on the steady rhythm of supply lines perfected by the Red Ball Express. The legacy also lived on in civilian life. The organization, precision, and teamwork learned from those convoys influenced the rise of post-war trucking in America. Many veterans of the Red Ball Express became professional drivers or mechanics after returning home, fueling the boom of transportation industries across the country. The same men who had once driven through the hell of France now helped build the arteries of post-war America, its highways, logistics networks, and trucking culture. In later years, documentaries, films, and books would revisit their story, often with a mix of awe and regret. Awe at their accomplishments and regret that it took so long for the world to recognize them. For decades, the Red Ball Express remained a footnote in World War II history, overshadowed by tanks, planes, and generals. But those who know the truth understand that without those convoys, the Allied advance would have come to a grinding halt. And at the heart of it all was one mechanic, one man whose vision had been dismissed as impractical, too simple, too worthless. His design, born from common sense and an understanding of what war truly required, had carried nations to victory. He may never have known how much he changed the world, but his idea became a lifeline that saved millions. His trucks carried not just supplies, but the spirit of perseverance itself. As the final convoys faded into memory, the Red Ball Express left behind a lesson that still rings true. In war, as in life, it's often the overlooked, the underestimated, and the ordinary that make the extraordinary possible. The mechanic's humble truck was never meant to be a symbol of glory, but it became one anyway, a testament to the quiet power of practicality, determination, and courage. Today, when historians look back at World War II, they see the Red Ball Express as proof that victory isn't just forged on the battlefield. It's delivered 1 mile at a time by men who never stop moving. The next time you see a convoy of trucks rumbling down a highway, remember that once, in a war that spanned the world, it was a line of such trucks, simple, rugged, and driven by heroes, that helped carry freedom across Europe. During World War II, one mechanic's truck design was called worthless. But that same design would become the lifeline of an entire army, powering the legendary Red Ball Express across war-torn Europe. If you enjoyed uncovering the untold story of the Red Ball Express, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because history's greatest heroes often come on wheels.